I wrote a resume through a typical template, and I looked at it and I'm like, this is absurd. I just have skate shop and surf shop experience. Why am I even sending this to an ad agency? So I said, well, if I can't show my creativity through the experience that I've had, maybe I can show it in how I express that experience. So because it was around Halloween, I went into this Halloween shop and they had those foam butts that you could tie around your waist to make it look like you have a naked butt. And I wrote my resume across the butt cheeks. And I wrote Cal Poly senior willing to work his ass off for internship. And then I went to a donut store and bought a pink box for $1. It was such a ripoff. And then I put it in the box and I mailed it to Shy Day. And 3 days later, they called me and asked me in. And I heard that the HR lady kept the butt on her wall for like a year.
Podcasting from Boulder, Colorado. This is the Baby Got Backstory podcast, where we dive into the story behind the story of today's most inspiring storytellers, creators, and entrepreneurs. I like big backstories, and I cannot lie. I am your host, Mark Gutman. I'm Mark Gutman, and on today's episode of Baby Got Backstory, how an Egyptian-American immigrant climbed to the top of the advertising agency world only to quit at 40 to become a successful stand-up comedian. Today we are talking with Tamer Kattan. And before we get into my conversation with Tamer, if you like and enjoy the show, please take a minute or two to rate and review us over at Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Apple and Spotify use these ratings as part of the algorithm that determines ratings on their charts. Better yet, please recommend the show to at least one friend you think will like it, and maybe one enemy who will like it too. And cross the aisle in a bipartisan effort to bring all podcast listeners together via the Baby Got Backstory podcast. Today's guest is Tamer Kattan. Tamer is an internationally touring stand-up comedian who performed for UN troops in Afghanistan, for protesters at the American University in Cairo during the Egyptian Revolution, and for the really dangerous crowds at the Edinburgh Fringe in Scotland, where he received 3 4-star reviews from international press. He was most recently featured on Seth Rogen's Hilarity for Charity event with Todd Glass and Hannibal Buress, won the World Series of Comedy, Comedy Knockout on True TV, Best of Fest at Big Pine Comedy Festival, and 3 weeks later won the Portland Comedy Festival. He is the co-host of Nice to Marry You, YouTube, and has TV and radio credits on the BBC and Sky TV in the UK, as well as in the US on Fox, Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, and True TV. He's also worked as a strategist at some of the world's biggest and best advertising agencies in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. And what you're going to hear today is there's probably not a whole lot that Tamer really can't do or isn't good at. And I was connected to Tamer via a previous guest on the show, Sean Parr of Bulldog Drummond. And no disrespect to Sean, but I wasn't clear on why he thought I should talk with Tamer. Well, Sean's a smart guy, and Tamer, well, I'm going to save that for today's show. What I will say is I'm crushing hard on Tamer. He's smart. He's worked at the coolest agencies on the biggest brands in the world, and he left it all behind to pursue what really made him happy: stand-up comedy. Tamer drops all sorts of insight and wisdom in this episode, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Oh, and make sure to listen for the Your Dog is Sticky story. I loved it. I'm excited to introduce you to Tamer Kattan, and this is his story. I am here with Tamer Kattan, and Tamer actually happens to be in Spain, and I'm in Colorado. And even though we've been doing this for decades at this point, talking over the internet, I'm still amazed that this works in real time and that we can do this. It's like still blows my mind, but
so true. Yeah.
Tamer, welcome. Welcome to the Baby Got Backstory podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's nice to be chatting with you. It's nice to see an American face.
Sometimes, right? It's been a tough week here in America, so maybe not so much. But Tamer is an internationally touring stand-up comedian. He's performed at the UN with before troops in Afghanistan, for protesters at the American University in Cairo during the Egyptian Revolution. Would love to hear about that. And that's not how we know each other. You know, I'm a big fan of comedy. I love comedy, but I was actually introduced to Tamer through another brand professional, Sean Parr over at Bulldog Drummond. And interesting enough, Tamer got his start as a brand strategist. And so, Tamer, I'd love to get into that a little bit, but like more than that, I want to know, you know, when you were young, was little Tamer, were you like, was it like almost like the two little angel devil on the shoulder, was like one a brand strategist and one a stand-up comedian, or like, what'd you want to be when you were a kid? Like, did you think you'd end up here?
Oh man, bipolar would be easy. I mean, I've been divided for a long time, and I have a Muslim dad and a Jewish mom. So like I've always just been a mixed up kid. I had people telling me I wasn't a real American, I wasn't a real Egyptian, I wasn't a real Jew, I wasn't a real Muslim. So like I've always kind of been a hyphenate as a person. I've always been comfortable being a hyphenate. And for me, quite honestly, like when I look at, I've always tried to sort of anticipate the direction of things. And I think even when I first got into advertising, I didn't get into it because I loved commercials. I got into it because I loved storytelling. And I see the big umbrella as storytelling, and I see brand strategy and comedy both fitting under that larger umbrella. So for me, it wasn't that different. You know, it's like being a wrestler that becomes a UFC fighter. It sounds like two different things, but they're kind of related.
Well, and absolutely, and I agree. But I think you articulate it very well that storytelling is a broad umbrella. I think a lot of people run around talking about being storytellers, but you still have to have that specific discipline, whether it be advertising, whether you're telling stories through comedy, whether you're telling, different channels. And so, I know myself, I made that mistake early in my career. I was running around telling everyone I was a storyteller because I was, but then it becomes really hard to find work because no one knows where you really fit. But where did you grow up? Like, what was childhood like for you? You mentioned that you had this bifurcated family, and you never really fit. Where'd you grow up, and what was that like? Like, what'd your parents do and stuff like that?
Well, we were in Egypt when I was a kid, and my dad left first, and he came to America. He went to Southern California, Santa Monica. Although initially it was easier to get a visa in colder weather states back then. So he originally got a visa for Utah. And then we were in Egypt, and, we're talking about technology right now, how blown away we are about how great it is to be able to speak across the world. And when my dad first immigrated to the States, I had these very vivid picture of my mom tracing my hand on a piece of paper to show my dad how fast I was growing. Like it was wild. And it was also a strange thing because at a very early age, it was kind of the reverse of an animal priming on something. Like when a cat gets adopted by a Labrador, it was like I got unglued from my dad for almost a year and a half, where he was in the States and my mom and I were in Cairo. So I was born in Cairo, and when I was around 6, my dad left for the States, and at 8 years old we reconnected in Los Angeles. So I grew up for the most part in Southern California, and the first place we lived was a very Mexican neighborhood in East LA, which was the best place an immigrant could start in America because they were very accepting, and they said, "Hey, you look like one of us. You got pyramids, we got pyramids. You're in." So they accepted me. And then from there, it's really strange being an immigrant. Sometimes you get to experience society in a different way because you start at maybe a lower socioeconomic class than you're used to in your home country. And then you kind of move pretty quickly vertically up sometimes, maybe do more jumps than you would have if you were a native born person. So we had a pretty interesting view of America at a pretty early age.
Yeah. And was it all positive or was it tough? I mean, one thing I can share with you is, I grew up in Detroit, and I have a Jewish father and a Christian mother. And I had a lot of those same challenges that I never really felt like I fit in. I never felt like I was really accepted by the Jewish side of the family or the other side. And, I was always kind of using like shape shifting a little bit and code switching, as they say, to my advantage. But there's also a lot of disadvantages. I remember being like, I am not Jewish, and like hiding, from fights and stuff like that. But that, that didn't matter to the kids that wanted to brand me with that label. I mean, was it hard for you, like being an immigrant and also just trying to figure out what your identity was? I mean, I think it's cool now to be like, yeah, I was split and it was awesome. But at the time, was it hard?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was, I so many times I remember uttering the phrase, I just want to be normal, which is like, as an adult, that's the last thing I want to be. But as a kid, I just kept feeling like I'm abnormal. Even the word they give immigrants is alien. So I always felt like I was kind of floating in space, but just like, emotions are just like physical pain sometimes. Like it hurt. I think I took so much emotional abuse that I finally built a callus, which I welcomed with open arms. And once that callus was there, then I learned to embrace the fact that, yeah, I'm not American, I'm not Egyptian, I'm this thing in the middle. And being an Egyptian American is very much another thing. It's a thing into its own. I'm not half of this or half of that. I'm a complete thing, and it happens to consist of two halves. But it took a lot of crappy things heard, a lot of racism, and not just from Americans, from other Egyptians, from Jewish people, from everybody. So it was a wild experience.
Yeah, I mean, I remember as a kid coming home crying because I wanted to have a communion, a Catholic communion more than anything. Because that's what all the kids were doing, and I was like, why can't I have it? Besides, I was like, they get a lot of money, that's cool. But like, really more than that, like I was like, they're all doing it, and I want to be like just those normal kids. And so I can totally relate where you're coming from. Did you? Like, was there a big Egyptian community in Southern California you were there? I mean, I spent a lot of time, I lived in Santa Monica for a while and things like that. And I don't ever remember it. So like, and I could just be because it's just, something I'm not looking for. But was there a big Egyptian community when you were there?
I think there is, but it's funny, a lot of these communities start to form, especially these immigrant communities start to form, and they're usually based on spirituality or religion. And so there's definitely an Egyptian community, but it's kind of forked. And on one side, there's the Muslim Egyptians, all kind of have the mosque as sort of the home base of their social life. And then you've got the Coptic Christian Egyptians. And for us, we didn't fit into either. So even though I was aware of an Egyptian community, I was very much an outsider to it.
And so what was life like for you as a kid in terms of school? Like, what were you into? Did you know from an early age that you were going to be a storyteller of sorts?
It's funny that you say that because it wasn't conscious at all. I spent a lot of time alone. And, back in the 80s, it was really cool. I was a latchkey kid. I was one of those kids, that had the house key tied, the string around my neck, and my parents both had to work two jobs. So there were times where I'd wake up in the morning and to an empty house, and I'd come home from school to an empty house. So I had a lot of time just to think. And I think that was the foundation of becoming a storyteller. It was just having a lot of time to yourself and to thinking. I really got into Dungeons and Dragons at a really early age. So my vocabulary of weapons and monsters and mythology grew. And when we started writing for this creative writing class that I had in elementary school, the teacher called my parents at home and said, "Hey, I need you to come in. We have to talk about Tamer and about these stories that he's writing." And they came in, and he said, "Look, I love these stories, but they're a little bit violent. And I'm either going to see his name on the front of a paper at the end of a movie, and I wanted to make sure that it's the latter." But he didn't know about Dungeons and Dragons, and that's why I knew so much about weapons, is because of that silly game.
You knew everything and nothing about weapons, right? Like
exactly.
You knew about what you knew from Dungeons and Dragons. But were you a funny kid at that time? And were you leaning into humor? And, and I've talked to a lot of people who either have tough childhoods, they don't feel like they fit, they've been maybe sometimes bullied, and humor is typically the defense mechanism. It's what they use to, keep people on their heels or to survive a bit. I mean, was that something for you, or was it something different?
Yeah, in a very big way. And again, it's just so bizarre because Because I am kind of a control freak, I think at times, and there was no design. It's not like I wanted to be funny. I desired to be funny. It was just a thing that happened. It was just something where they said, "Oh, you're just like your grandfather," and inevitably, it ended up becoming a tool against bullies. But I didn't realize it until this one day when this kid came up to me and he said, it was a bully that bullied me every day. And finally, one day I had enough and I started making fun of him because he had pretty big ears. And apparently he was sensitive because he said, "Hey, if you stop making fun of me, I'll stop beating you up." And that's when I went, "Oh, wow. Comedy's powerful. It can be powerful." You know?
Words have power. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, were you doing stand-up routines in high school? Like, were you at the talent show? I mean, were you getting into this early?
No, not at all. We had this really interesting thing. There's actually Detroit made this famous in Eminem's movie 8 Mile. Battle rapping came from a thing called playing the dozens. And playing the dozens is you just make fun of each other back and forth. And it came from slavery when they used to sell slaves one at a time unless there was something wrong with them. And then they would sell them as a dozen in a cage. And those dozen slaves would make fun of each other. And that's where all those jokes like your mama jokes came from. And like those really harsh, almost like, even we look at roast battles, like that environment was the foundation for that. So in the neighborhood I lived in, we had, hello, cat. There's my cat in the background. We'd play the dozens. So it was a pretty poor school. And we had a 10-minute break before lunch called nutrition, where the government would give you milk and trail mix. And I was always just, people would jump on me during those sessions and start just making fun of me and sort of attack me with words. And, just like with any other type of battling, the more you get beat up, the better you get on the offensive. So I just naturally became pretty good with words.
Yeah. And were you a good student?
I was. Yeah. It was funny. There was some cultural things I had to stop doing. Like I was in the habit of raising my hand to answer a question, then standing up to answer it. And that usually ended with me getting beat up at recess.
You learn quickly not to do that. And then yeah. I mean, what had your parents hoped for you? I mean, they're working their butts off. They're doing 2 jobs. They're immigrants. I mean, I have to imagine it's a bit of that American dream that they're hoping for a better life. They're hoping for something great for you. And what was that?
Well, it's really interesting because my dad, because he was the one who felt like he was absorbing most of the risk, and the one who out of all of us, he's probably the one that felt like he was, walking a wire without a net, because we were in America without a family, without friends. And I think he felt like you always had to have a job, and that job was what protected you from homelessness or like a terrible life. So he didn't care what I liked. He just wanted me to do what was safe. So in his mind, the ultimate job was doctor, lawyer, engineer. That was the 3. But I didn't want to do any of those things. I ended up going to university for kinesiology. I didn't even know what I was going to do with it. I was like a strength and conditioning coach or something like that. But I basically took those classes just so my dad thought that I was doing pre-med, but I wasn't. And it was my junior year where I interned as a strength and conditioning coach. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to wear these polyester shorts for the rest of my life. And a friend of mine said, hey, I'm a marketing major, and this ad agency is coming to Cal Poly, and they're going to show their commercial reel. And I heard that it's really great. These are the guys that invented the Energizer Bunny. So I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. So I went with him. I watched the reel, and there were so many funny commercials. And, and she kept talking about the woman, Nancy Alley. I still remember her name. It's so crazy. Nancy Alley said that comedy was the most disruptive form of storytelling, because you didn't need to know anything. You could watch a stranger fall down and it's funny. But if you're trying to do a drama in 15 seconds, good luck. So I watched that reel and I was impressed by it. And I thought to myself, oh, wow, here's a way to get paid for being funny. And I went up to her and I spoke to her and I said, my major's not marketing. She goes, doesn't matter. I recommend you buy this book called Inventing Desire. And it was a book where a journalist actually lived in the offices of Chiat Day. At the time, it was just one office, but an amazing office. And I literally borrowed $4 more so I could buy the book that night. And I read it in one night and fell in love with the idea of working in an ad agency.
What about that book spoke to you?
The honesty. I always thought that when you work in a corporate environment that you couldn't be yourself anymore. I felt like it was constrained. And in the book, she was sort of showing the type of conversations people had, and they were cussing. And I think as a kid, I was like, oh, wow, these adults are cussing. And it was just real, and they were passionate. And they were creating something. They were creating stories. And so I got really excited. And I remember I did the craziest thing. It was around Halloween. And I heard that they got something like 400 resumes a day for internships. And I wrote a resume through a typical template. And I looked at it and I'm like, this is absurd. I just have skate shop and surf shop experience. And why am I even sending this to an ad agency? So I said, well, if I can't show my creativity through the experience that I've had, maybe I can show it in how I express that experience. So because it was around Halloween, I went into this Halloween shop and they had those foam butts that you could tie around your waist to make it look like you have a naked butt. And I wrote my resume across the butt cheeks. And I wrote Cal Poly senior willing to work his ass off for internship. And then I went to a donut store and bought a pink box for $1. It was such a ripoff. And then I put it in the box and I mailed it to Chiat Day. And 3 days later, they called me and asked me in. And I heard that the HR lady kept the butt on her wall for like a year.
And did you end up getting the internship?
Yeah, I got the job. Yeah.
That's amazing.
and it turned into a job too.
Oh, that's amazing. And so how long did you work for Chiat Day? And forget that. Let's back up a second. So you're a young kid. You're like, I'm going to go to the preeminent advertising firm in the world. You impress them. You do a great job. And that's one of the things I do love about advertising, marketing, branding. It's like talent speaks, And so you got their attention and so what was the first day like?
It was funny. And to underpin your point, the people who worked they told me, listen, we don't have an opening in creative, but we have an opening in broadcast. And the people there liked my resume so much because everything else, they seemed like they were bored of the other resumes they were getting. So they primed me to interview with Richard O'Neill, who is the executive producer on the George Orwell spot, 1984. And I guess he said, I'd refuse to accept an intern here who's not in film school. And so they basically told me, you're going to lie. You're going to say that you're in film school. And I remember being really oh my God, I can't lie. I was a kid and I'm like, can I lie to this man? But they told me, you're going to lie. And if you have to go to film school late, then we'll send you to film classes at night. But we want you here. You want to be here. This is the last gatekeeper. And we're going to tell you what you need to do to get the job. And
that's amazing.
That's what happened. Yeah, it was pretty wild.
And so you walked in and what was it like? Was it, because I remember when I lived in California, passing the building in Venice, and it had the big kind of binocular. It was binoculars, right? Yeah, exactly. Giant binoculars out front. It just seemed like, I never went in, and it just seemed like the place where really cool things happened. Where
exactly.
really cool things were created, and it had this mystique and aura to me. I wasn't even in the advertising business. I was in the film business. I was like, that looks really, really cool.
Yeah.
What was it like when you got in there?
Oh,
kind of take us behind the curtain.
That song, I the Tiger from the 80s?
Yeah.
It was like walking into that song. Everything, my heart rate just started going up. We went in, I remember my first little tour, and as they welcomed interns just like real employees, and we got a tour of the place, and they gave us a coffee mug that said innovate or die. And then they had and then I had another, that was the coffee mug, and the t-shirt said, who wants to be an effing ad agency? And just the logo was like a skull and crossbones. And it was, all about disruptive thinking and breaking conventions. And it was just sexy, really sexy thinking and really sexy ideas. And they had punching bags in the office that had management heads on screen printed on the punching bags. So you could, and I'm like, this place is so cool. It was like nothing I'd seen before. And I felt like I was home.
Yeah. And rock and roll culture.
Yeah.
But so the culture's cool and you're looking around, but what about the work? What was going on? What did you get to work on? And what were some of your first experiences?
I was greatly intimidated when I started. And, the work initially, I was just a broadcast assistant. Actually, I was an intern at first. And what was happening is it was really interesting when you're an intern at a place like that, because there's so many interns and and so many of them go in and out that a lot of times people don't spend a lot of time getting to know you. So I did very menial tasks in the beginning, but I went out of my way to show that I wanted more than that. So, I would do all the typical things like get coffee, pick up food, photocopies back when that was the thing to do. But then I'd go up to the guy who was the video editor at the time. It was on an Avid system, and I'd say, hey, can I go to lunch with you? And can I buy a piece of pizza? Because it's all I could afford, and ask you about editing. And I think that it's so funny because it's such a simple thing. And I remember as a kid looking at this grown man and going, oh, it brought him joy that I took a real interest in what he was really passionate about. And I remember feeling off balance a little bit that I was this young guy that kind of touched this older person. It was sort of a role reversal in my mind, I thought. So I think I didn't have the sexiest job, but because I stayed passionate the whole time, and because I didn't let the menial labor get me down. And I ended up getting hired after the internship was over. And then, I immediately was working on Nissan, Gatorade, Zima at the time, really big stuff, like really big high profile accounts. And even though I was, the tiniest part of the totem pole, it still felt great to see my fingerprint, on these things.
Yeah. And it's, even talking about the Avid editing machines, I remember those. They were like, it was like the dawn of like nonlinear editing, and it was such a big deal. And they were like, $100,000 or $60,000 for a machine. And I just remember, you had a bay of them. And I just remember thinking like, who could ever, only the craziest people could ever edit on a computer, like how does that happen? And then the process of transferring the film to digital was that was my first job. Actually, I would drive the film to the processing studio, and wow. So I knew a lot about it, but it was just crazy. And so, but I also, I had a similar experience in that I was a young person living in Santa Monica and living in California, and it was tough, it was expensive. It was competitive. Like, how did you fare? Like, I mean, you loved it and you're working on these accounts, but like, how are you getting by? Because I'm guessing they're not paying you a ton.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was 18,000. That was my first salary. And then they gave me like a American Express corporate card. And I don't think I understood how to use that card. So I would use it not realizing, oh shit, I got to pay this immediately, So I wasn't very smart. I lived on Electric Avenue in Venice when Venice was still, Venice to this day, there's a coffee shop that has kind of the unofficial slogan of Venice Beach, which is where art meets crime. And that's what Venice was like. I lived on Electric Avenue, and there was, there's a lot of crime. You'd hear gunshots at night. I lived not too far from Chiat, but it was scary at night. And, it was my first time living on my own. And I struggled for sure to, figure out how to pay bills and how to be organized. But I loved going to work. And so if there was one part of me that was acting like an adult, it was the part that went to work.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see Venice today and how it's changed. I mean, my first apartment was on Navy Street in Venice, right on the border, and I was so excited because I had this I'm not kidding you, like a 2-inch sliver view to the ocean. And being a kid from Michigan, I was like, I'm on the ocean or whatever. But it was an awful place, and it was super tiny, and like a studio I shared with somebody. But I was like, you'd be in Venice, and once the sun went down, I'd be scared. So I get it, and it's tough. And so you're working at Chiat Day, and is this? You think this is it? Your future? This is all you're going to do for the rest of your life? Where do you go from here?
No, it's funny. I'd never worked like that before. So, and I didn't really pace myself. I felt like Chiat Day was a marathon, and I sprinted as fast as I could. And I'd say about a year and a half in, I'd had enough. And I heard a friend of mine started an outrigger canoe school in Hawaii. And I was like, boy, does that sound good. And he invited me to work with him. And I remember the day I quit, there was a woman named Elaine Hinton, who was the vice president of broadcast. I'm not sure if she's still there. And she was an amazing woman. And she basically looked at me and said, "Are you crazy? What are you doing?" And I said, I'm going to Hawaii. She goes, "You're leaving Chiat Day to go to Hawaii to paddle canoes." And I go, I gained weight. I was sitting in these cold editing rooms. and I didn't know how to pace myself, so I burned out and I left. I went to Hawaii, and she tried her best to put some wisdom in me, but it was the right thing for me at the time. I ended up working at Shaite 2 more times in the future. So I always went back. I just spoke to Rob Schwartz the other day, who's the chief creative officer at Shaite New York. Well, actually, he's the first creative that became a CEO of Shaite. And, we still talk, and I retweeted a post and he said something like, once a pirate, always a pirate, and and it felt great, because Shaite was more than an agency for me. It became a part of my identity, as did Bulldog Drummond when I worked with Sean. He was definitely another sticker that I had in my suitcase, a big one.
Yeah, and so you're in Hawaii. Anything major come of this canoe school, outrigger canoe school, or
the biggest thing was boredom. Oh my God, it was so. I didn't realize what island living was like until I remember going shopping and seeing this cool shirt, and I'm like, oh, this shirt's great, and I was excited about wearing it to a nightclub and meeting a girl. And I went into the nightclub and there were like 6 other guys with the same shirt. And I'm like, I'm getting out of here. This is terrible.
Not a lot of choice on the island, right?
Not a lot of choice. Yeah. And I'm like, so I lasted about 6 months in Hawaii.
That's awesome. And you came back to California?
Came back to California. I ended up, I did a little bit of a left turn where I worked in the fashion industry for a little bit. My family on the Jewish side are garmentos, talk about a cliche, right? And so I ended up working for this big fashion trade show called Magic. It was the Men's Apparel Guild in California. And I learned a lot about the fashion industry, but I always still identified as an ad person, as someone who understood brand, and always thought, oh, that's going to hurt the brand. You can't do that. Whenever we talked about sales goals versus communication goals, I'd always be the person who was trying to do my best to protect the brand. So even when I was at these other industries, I still felt a pull back towards working at the brand level.
And is that when you went back to Shaite?
Yeah, I ended up going back to Shaite years later. I worked at Deutsch, at Shaite, Young and Rubicam. So I kind of did a little tour. I even worked at Leo Burnett in Chicago and also in Dubai.
Yeah, I mean, is there any A-list agency you didn't work at?
Yeah, Saatchi and Saatchi is the one that I haven't worked at.
But I had like Love Marks. Is that their book? Love Marks that they
Love Marks. Yeah, I love it. It's funny too because I love that book, and I remember reading that book and going, "Oh, I really want to work at Saatchi," but the timing wasn't right, and I always had other things popping up. So I've never worked at Saatchi.
Yeah, there's still time. But like, at what point did you become what you would consider a brand strategist?
I think, it's funny because I got the label of brand strategist when I first started working with Sean. And it was because there was 2 ways into brand strategy, I thought, at an early age, which was I always knew I wanted to get into brand strategy, but I was pretty young at the time. And I noticed that a lot of them either had British accents or Ivy League educations. And so I said, all right, I don't have experience as a strategist. So this is me going back to the type of thinking I had when I gave them the foam butt, right? Where I said, I have to start thinking about what they want, what's going to disrupt their thinking, what's going to be different. And so when I was approaching Sean, I said, I don't want to approach him and say, hey, I can be a strategist for the clients you have now. I'd rather say, okay, I'm not a strategist yet. I don't have experience as a strategist, but what I do have is a tremendous amount of experience in action sports. And so even though I'm not a strategist, I have the type of instincts and understanding of the culture that drives these categories that I don't care how British the strategist is. I don't care if he went to Harvard. He doesn't know more about skateboards and surfboards and the community than I do. And that's the way that I positioned myself. And Sean ended up hiring me to pitch Airwalk. And at the time, Airwalk was pretty big business. And I remember when we won that pitch, there was an article that came out and they referred to us as, David and Goliath, the little agency that beat all the big agencies.
Was it Bulldog Drummond at the time?
Yeah.
So I have 2 very good friends who both appeared on this podcast who were principals in the marketing at Airwalk on the snow side. One guy by the name of Steve Nilsson, who goes by Sticks. I don't know if you ever ran into him.
I remember Sticks. Oh my God.
And, he was on the podcast. Now he actually works, he's doing marketing with Liquid Death, the water company. I don't know if you've
Wow.
seen
Yeah.
Liquid
It's
Death.
fun. I just saw them on LinkedIn the other day, and I was checking out the brand. As soon as you said Styx, it clicked.
Yeah,
That's
and
so
Mike
funny.
Arts, and literally, he was right before this call texting me about Linda Nylander, who you may have worked with as well at Airwalk,
Yeah.
who was a marketing principal. But anyways, that's crazy. That's crazy. So
Yeah.
you went, you got Airwalk, and I think weren't they doing a lot of work out here in Colorado? Weren't they like
Yeah. We were in Evergreen almost every week. And at one point I was living in Denver
Okay.
and commuting to, was it Evergreen or yeah, I think it was Evergreen.
Yeah, Genesee, right? Like I think it was technically Genesee, right next to Evergreen, but
Yeah.
where the office was.
Right.
Yeah, that's crazy. And so that's how you got on Sean's radar?
Yeah, kind of. And I knew, I started reading a lot of books. I at first I thought, oh, the way to be a strategist is to get mentored at an agency, and it was tough to find a mentorship strategy side. So I ended up just reading tons of books. Love Marks was one of them. The Pirate Inside. There were a lot of books that really kind of steered my thinking, and I started developing my own sort of point of view. And then also thinking of myself, like being a little bit more, being a better listener about what drives my decisions, and not being afraid to go, I know I'm just a focus group of one, but I can use that as something to then try to quantify. I'm not going to make a statement based on my solo opinion, but I can absolutely have a hypothesis. And I don't think I allowed myself to do that before. So I think it also took a little bit of time. I needed a little bit of maturity to have. I think you need a little bit of confidence mixed with a touch of arrogance to be a strategist.
And any other books that influenced your thinking at that time that you remember?
Oh yeah, there was a book on archetypes that I remember just blew my mind open. I think it was the Outlaw, the Cowboy and the Outlaw, or something like that. And it was about the 13 different archetypes in storytelling. And yeah, it was a lot of those things. And what I ended up doing as well is, I noticed agencies at the time, it was really popular to put case studies on their websites. And even when they filled out case studies for effectiveness awards. And I said, a lot of people ignore these, but what a great education to read how different agencies deconstruct their pitches and how they found their insight and what the insight was that they found, whether it was quantitatively or qualitatively. So I just started digging into entries for competitions from different ad agencies and digging into case studies of different ad agency websites. I've always been a big fan of sort of MacGyvering knowledge, and figuring out smart ways of gaining information quickly.
This episode brought to you by Wild Story. Wait, isn't that your company? It is. And without the generous support of Wild Story, this show would not be possible. A brand isn't a logo or a tagline or even your product. A brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, service, or company. It's what people say about you when you're not in the room. Wild Story helps progressive founders and savvy marketers build purpose-driven brands that connect their business goals with the customers they want to serve so that both the business and the customer needs are met. This results in crazy, happy, loyal customers that purchase again and again, and this is great for business. If that sounds like something you and your team might want to learn more about, reach out at www.wildstory.com and we'd be happy to tell you more. Now back to our show. And then, so at what point, you mentioned that you were bestowed the title, and I have a very similar. I remember like one of my very first jobs, I was a story editor, and at a studio, it's a really big job, but when you're a production company, it means a lot of different things. And I was way over my head. I was doing, script analysis, but also picking up dry cleaning as well. And, at what point did you actually feel like you were a brand strategist, versus having that title?
I think, there was one moment where I felt like I wasn't trying to prove I was a strategist, but I actually brought something that was different. I felt like I was a very good strategist. And it was a moment when I was moderating a focus group. Actually, no, I take that back. Somebody else was moderating. I was behind the glass. And sometimes I think a lot of agency people at times will get bored. It's tedious work to watch someone else moderate a focus group. And it was for Mitsubishi at the time, I think. And we're watching all these SUV people that were intending to buy an SUV within 6 months or within a year. And, there's the typical discussion guide, which is so full of questions that it actually doesn't create a discussion. It's just question and answer. And there's a moment during focus groups where moderators come into the room and ask the people behind the glass, do you have any more questions you want to ask? And when the moderator came back, I kept watching the people because I was interested. And when I was watching them, I noticed people showing each other pictures, and they were pictures of their dogs. So I said to the moderator, hey, can you ask how many of them are dog owners? And he looked at me and said, what? And I'm like, I'm just curious, the number of people that buy SUVs. I'm curious if they're dog owners. So he went in and asked, and it was something like 7 out of 10. And we were like, whoa, that's a pretty big percentage. The next group was only 5, but then the next 2 groups were like 8 and 9 out of 10. So then we did it. It was like a Survey Monkey thing where we quantified it and said, whoa, we have something. There's something really interesting about, there's definitely a correlation between people who buy SUVs and people who are dog owners. So we approached Mitsubishi and said, hey, you've got competition with all your competition when they create packages for their various SUVs. They've got technology packages, they've got luxury packages, they've got all these different sort of packages, but nobody has a dog package. And there were these Japanese business guys who are pretty intimidating to pitch to. And they started clapping. And it just tickled me, man. I was just, and one of them gave us this Hunter S. Thompson quote where he said, I don't believe the truth is ever told between the hours of 9 and 5. He's like, people connect between 9 and 5 with certain things in common, but the things after 5 o'clock are stickier. He's like, and your dog is very sticky. It's more sticky than these other things. And I was like, when you had the guy on the brand side convincing his own team of the insight, I was like, okay, I'm proud of myself. I can give myself a pat on the back on that one.
Oh, that's so awesome. That's great. And so during this time, it sounds like your career's going pretty great and you're making a way for yourself. Are you practicing comedy at all, or is that something that's yet to come up?
No, actually, it's funny. It went a little, it was a little dark period for me, to be honest. Like, Robin Williams used to always say, cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money. And I was like a single guy making a lot of money. And I just started partying a lot and going out with friends. And I kind of slipped after I reached a point where I'm like, yeah, I'm proud of myself. I'm a great strategist. And then I just became the worst strategist for about 3 years. And all of a sudden, I think the worst label they've ever given strategists is the smartest guy in the room. I think it's detrimental to have people think that that's what they have to live up to. And I didn't ask as many questions because I got a little bit of a little arrogant. And I stopped being happy with advertising. I wasn't as excited anymore. And then my dad passed away. And when my dad passed away, I had this really weird moment where I realized everything that I was doing was to try to make my dad proud of me. And it was the first time where I said, well, what makes you happy? And I'd never really done that. And I sort of had this big cleansing period where I stopped drinking. I learned transcendental meditation. I just kind of grabbed the steering wheel back. And I was shocked that at 39, 40 years old, I'd never really known what makes me happy and what was a driver for me. And so I ended up saying, hey, I've always wanted to do comedy. But I was afraid to do it, to be honest, because comedy for me was an identity, and I really didn't have that. I was always not fully Egyptian, not fully American, not fully Jewish, not fully Arab, but I was funny and everyone agreed I was funny. So I was afraid to try to be a comedian because what if they told me, oh, you know what? We are also not funny. And then I would have just been floating in space. So I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had a friend of mine who ended up marrying Dick Van Dyke, believe it or not. She's a girl. She was my girlfriend in high school and then fell in love with Dick Van Dyke. And now they're a married couple and they're amazing together. But her brother and I were both the funny guys in high school. And she bumped into me at a supermarket and said, hey, John is doing stand-up Do you want to go see him? And I'm like, oh my God, are you kidding me? And I remember getting really excited at the thought of someone so close to me performing stand-up comedy. And not only was he good at the show, he blew every other comic away. And at that point, I thought to myself, well, if John is that much better than everyone else, and John and I were the funny guys in high school, if I could just be a little bit, if I could be even close to as good as he is, this will be fun. And I didn't think it was going to turn into anything else. I thought I was just going to take one class and get on stage once and have it be a bucket list thing. But then professional comedians started approaching me and saying, hey, you got something. And I did the Edinburgh Fringe in Scotland, and I won Best New International Act under 2 years. And I had a manager sign me, and I came back to the States and quit my job in advertising and sold my house and sold my car and moved to England and lived in a box for 4 years doing stand-up.
And how was that? Was that great, or was it?
It was the best. I went from driving a fancy car, living in a house in the Hollywood Hills with a view of the Hollywood sign, to literally living in an apartment with no windows, right? It was owned by the comedy club. When we showered, it was me and another comedian that lived there. Whenever we showered, we had to open a skylight so that the house wouldn't turn into a sauna. Like, it was terrible. And we lived behind a chicken shop with a really high fence. So people thought behind the fence was a dumpster. So every night I'd come home, there'd be a bag of chicken bones at my doorstep. So, I mean, I went from top of the world to bottom of the world in terms of residence, but I was the happiest I've ever been.
What, it's so crazy. Like, how did you have and find the courage to make that decision? I mean, you said you're like 39, 40 years old. Things are going good. I mean, it's got to be scary to enter into.
Sure.
I mean, I can't believe there was one, and I've done stand-up. I can't believe there's one stand-up comedian that said, hey, kid, this is easy. This is an easy
No.
life, right? This is both easy business and an easy life. I know it's hard. Like, where did you find that strength to pursue that dream?
This is going to sound so silly, but it you know how I said, when I was a kid, I didn't even know what made me funny, just something that kind of happened. I think I've always just been drawn to that. I think we're all supposed to do something, and I didn't want to give up looking for it, and I felt like advertising was very, very close to it. And I still love advertising. I still actively read about ads and case studies. I think it's brilliant. It's literally, to me, it's our version of carving hieroglyphics on a pyramid. It's the digital version of doing that. And I think it's a privilege to work with some brands, for sure. But for me, I think I was at a point where I didn't have much to lose. I was single. I didn't think I was going to get married. I was, I wasn't happy at my advertising job. I was in a situation that was tough for everyone. It was a digital ad agency that wanted to go full service, which is, everybody in advertising knows, is one of the toughest growing pains culturally for an agency to go from just digital to full service. Even if it's digitally led, it was really hard for them to embrace strategy. So I had a hard job there, especially as, you get the title of change agent, and you think it's nice, but people don't like change. And so I had a tough time going into an office where I felt like a lot of people didn't like me, and then going on stage at night, and I had people coming up to me and hugging me and saying, hey, your joke about child abuse, my dad beat me too. And then I get a hug from a guy that looked like he was in Sons of Anarchy. And I'm like, hey, this is really spiritually fulfilling. And so it was a pretty easy decision at the end.
So what's funny about brand strategy and advertising?
It's the human nature. I feel like I said this to one of my friends, and he always asked me about religion. I go, no, we don't know why we're here. It's like we're on level 1 of an escape room. And instead of working together to figure out how to get to level 2, we all just started fighting in the escape room. So I like figuring things out. I love using my emotional intelligence, especially because I feel like that's something that us men have, and it's an underdeveloped thing in us. I think women have always been told to grab onto intuition, and men have been told that we don't have that. And women grow up with these impossible physical standards, and then men are told things like boys don't cry. So we have impossible emotional standards. And I think I saw how much that hurt me when I was younger, to not talk about problems, it feels I like being an observer. I think being a good listener makes you a better storyteller. And I love being able to listen so aggressively, until I hear things and see things that other people don't see. Like in my comedy, the thing that brings me the most joy is not when people laugh. It's when people say, "Oh my God, that's so true." That's my favorite.
So speaking of that, do you have, or can you recall a joke, and you don't have to do line for line, maybe just the kind of the premise that you just love and you think is so insightful, but others don't?
Oh yeah. I mean, I had, you know what I love? I love the joke that kind of changes people's minds a little bit and gives them perspective. And so I said, I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm an Arabic comedian, and Little Rock, Arkansas, while Trump was running. And somebody yelled out, he's Arab. That name's Arab. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't be afraid of me. I should be afraid of you. I'm like, because cowboy hats for me are like turbans for you. And then and this room is full of a bunch of cowboy hats. And I go, let's be honest, yeehaw is just white people for Allah Akbar. And then they all started laughing. And once I said that, they all started laughing, man. And it was really nice. And it showed the power of comedy, Yeah. And that's when, boy, its hooks got in me after that.
I mean, do you face that a lot? Do you face a lot of racism and a lot of people heckling you while you're on stage because you're Arabic?
I mean, I'm pretty lucky. I have a pretty high number of laughs per minute. I'm a pretty punchy comic, and I think sometimes that helps you manage hecklers. And two, I was a comic in New York for a long time, and people are pretty vocal in New York, so I'm pretty good at managing hecklers. But the number of people that come up to me after the show, when Trump was running, I got 3 death threats, and that was shocking. That's the first time that's ever happened. So it was scary. It was a little bit scary when that happened. I didn't expect it. But then there were, it also taught me a lot about human beings. Like I thought I really understood America because I worked at these ad agencies in New York and Chicago and Miami and LA. And I'm like, oh, I know America. And I didn't until I became a comedian and started going to Little Rock and Wichita, Kansas. And then I started knowing America. But I also realized, I remember going on stage one night and getting booed really badly because I was introduced as an Arab comedian. And then I thought to myself, and the owner of the club said, listen, I'm really sorry. We have good people here and we have bad people here, but sometimes we get bad people. And I understand if you want to leave early, and I'll pay you for tonight and I'll fill the other nights. And he goes, I'll let you think about it. And I said, okay. And I went home and I said, no, I'm not going to quit because that's not right. And I said, I don't like the way I was introduced. So let me manage this. Right. And I remember my grandfather used to say this thing that I had above my desk at my ad agency, which was listening is the cost of being heard. And so I needed to show them that I listened. I needed to show them if they think that I'm on their side, then I'm going to be different than the Arab that they perceived. So I told the guy, don't say I'm an Arab, just introduce me as a guy from LA. So he did. And when I went up on stage, I said, hey, this is my first time in Oklahoma City. I'm on SAC. This is a really beautiful place. It's really pretty here. And I didn't know because people in LA talk a lot of crap about you guys. Did you guys know that? And they're like, yup. And they started agreeing with me. And I'm like, that's crazy. How could they talk? And this guy said to me, if you're going to go to Oklahoma, you better watch out. They're really racist over there. And I'm like, you mean they're going to judge me without even knowing me? And he goes, yeah. I'm like, wow, have you ever been to Oklahoma? And he goes, no. And I'm like, what an asshole. And the whole audience laughed and they all clapped their hands. And at that point, they owed me. I stood up for them when they were the minority. I was in the big city defending a small town from big city people. So then when I became an Arab in front of them, they started managing themselves. When somebody tried to heckle me, it was another person at a table next to him that said, hey man, shut up, let him finish. And it was great. And I think that's what it means to be a human being. We're parts of multiple tribes and multiple groups. And I think if you break the ridiculous stereotypes, people become people again.
Yeah, what an amazing example of how to connect with someone that is different from you, that might have different beliefs, might even be against you upon first impression, and how to bridge that. That's just I love that story.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's really great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm a little little speechless, which doesn't happen often. Tamer, where can people learn more about you and your comedy? Where might we be able to see you?
Well, until COVID, but I do a lot of Zoom shows now. My website's a great place, which is tamerkattan.com. And then I also have a YouTube series with my wife that we do every week. It's sort of a marriage social experiment. We got married on the day we met. And and so we do that. That comes out every Wednesday, and that's a great place to follow us too.
Well,
and Instagram too.
Really quickly, let's talk about that. Like, can you tell that story quickly about like getting married the day you met? That's awesome.
Sure. I mean, when I was a kid, I've always loved traveling, but when I didn't have money, I would use the internet to travel, like with videos and pictures and things like that. And so when quarantine started, I really missed traveling. So I found out that Bumble, the dating app, had this feature called Passport where you could be in another city. And so I was in Spain. And I didn't think anything of it because it was, so far away. But I met this amazing Swedish woman, and we had so much in common. I was blown away and almost frustrated too, because I was like, God, we have all this stuff in common, and she lives thousands of miles away. And what happened was, because she was so far away, we were almost like playing a game of chicken with honesty and just being really brutally honest with each other about our flaws. Like even my profile was like, oh, I've been single this long because I'm selfish. I used to have a drinking problem. I'm this, I'm that. I basically did the opposite of what everybody else did in their profile. And then she sent me an email back that mimicked what I'd written about all of her flaws. And it became like a game with us. And so then I fell in love, and the laws had changed in Barcelona. And I already had COVID in March, and I had papers saying I had the antibodies. So I had this window to fly into Barcelona. So I flew in, and then when I got there, they changed the law when I was in the air, and they put me in jail in the airport, and I had to spend the night in jail. And she was 500 feet away from me, and we didn't meet. And they flew me back to America, and I'm like, I'm not giving up. And then we did a bunch of research, and we found out about Gibraltar, which is a tiny country that's on Spanish soil, but kind of a UK property, sort of. And they were allowing Americans in. And it was also like the Las Vegas of Europe. And so I flew in there, we met there, and I brought her a ring and asked her to marry me the first time I saw her. And she said, yeah, and we got married, and it's been 6 months, and now we're in Barcelona. Until COVID's over, and we'll figure out what we'll do next.
Yeah, and that's an incredible story, and I can't wait to now start watching your YouTube show, because now I'm really curious. You set that up really well. So Tamer, I mean, as we come to a close here, I mean, if you ran into that young Tamer who is like 9 years old and kind of figuring things out and obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons and being a latchkey kid, like if he saw you today, what do you think he'd say?
Man, you're so insightful for saying that. Like when people ask me, why did you start doing comedy at 40? I go, I didn't. I started at 9. Like, I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for him. Like I think he'd be proud of me. It feels weird to say that. Like I hate complimenting myself, but I think he would. I think he'd be proud of me. I think the older version thinks I'm silly and immature, but I think the little kid version of me thinks I'm like a male Pippi Longstocking, and he digs it.
And that is Tamer Kattan. I could have listened to Tamer's stories for hours, and I'm glad he saved his story about marrying his wife the day he met her till the very end. Tamer's story really is one of the American dream, but maybe we should be calling it the human dream, because Tamer's ability to connect and empathize with people, even those who are initially out to get him or condemn him, is admirable. And I think at this time in our country, we can all learn a lot from the Egyptian American kid from Los Angeles who is now living in Spain telling jokes for a living. Maybe we should just be a little bit more like Tamer. A big thank you to Tamer Kattan and Sean Parr for the intro. I'm sure it comes as no surprise, but I'm a huge Tamer fan, and I'm guessing by this point you are too. We will link to all things Tamer Kattan, his website, his YouTube show, his socials in the show notes. And if you know of a guest who should appear on our show, please drop me a line at podcast@wildstory.com. Our best guests, like Tamer, come from referrals from past guests and our listeners. Well, that's the show. Until next time. Make sure to visit our website, www.wildstory.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode.
I like big stories and I cannot lie. You other storytellers can't deny.